There are moments in a relationship that no one ever talks about, not out loud, not honestly, the quiet negotiations that happen behind closed doors. The silent compromises that never get acknowledged. The things you bury so deep for so long that you eventually start to believe they were never really there at all. For more than 2 decades, Deborra-Lee Furness and Hugh Jackman held a place in the world's imagination that very few couples ever reach. Not because they were the most glamorous. Not because they were the loudest or the most visible, but because they felt real. In an industry built on illusion, they felt like something genuine, something chosen. They were the couple that people quietly pointed to when they needed proof, when they needed to believe that real, lasting love could still survive inside the machinery of Hollywood. And then without warning it was over. No slow public unraveling, no dramatic confrontation caught by cameras, just a statement, a separation. And a silence that somehow landed heavier than anything they had ever said publicly. A silence that lingered, that asked questions no one quite knew how to answer. The world moved on the way it always does. The news cycle spun forward. Hugh stepped back into the spotlight, film sets, press junkets, a new chapter already in motion. Deborra-Lee moved differently. She pulled back, she went quiet, she returned to herself. But then she started writing, and that changes everything. Because now questions are rising to the surface that were never there before. Not accusations, not a tabloid unloading, something far more deliberate than that, something far more personal. A book that, according to people who have followed her closely, reads like a woman finally giving herself permission to speak, after years and years of choosing silence instead. The question is not only what she wrote. The question is what she felt she had to say. And why now, after all this time, she decided that silence was no longer something she was willing to offer. Because timing is never accidental. And a woman like Deborra-Lee Furness does not do anything without intention. Something shifted, deep and real and irreversible. And the world is only beginning to understand what that something actually was. To understand why any of this matters, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the polished Hollywood version, the real one. The one that didn't come with a publicist or a press release. Hugh Jackman was 27 years old when he walked onto the set of an Australian television drama called Corelli in 1995. He was relatively unknown, still finding himself. Still figuring out what kind of actor, what kind of man he wanted to be. Deborra-Lee Furness was already the established name. She was 39, 12 years older, and by every account from people who were there, she was the one who saw something in him before the rest of the world had any idea who he was. They married in 1996. Just 1 year after meeting. In an industry where marriages are often measured in months, not years, that kind of decision was a statement on its own. They weren't chasing momentum or performing for an audience. They chose each other quickly and completely because something between them felt right in a way that didn't need to be explained. What they built together was real and substantial. 2 adopted children, Oscar and Ava. A shared philosophy about family, about the meaning of fame, about what actually mattered when the cameras were off. Deborra-Lee was speaking openly about adoption advocacy long before it became a mainstream conversation. She founded Hopeland in Australia, an organization dedicated to reforming the country's adoption system. This was not a celebrity's side hobby. It was the work she had chosen for her life. The thing that defined her independently of anything else. Meanwhile, Hugh rose, slowly at first, and then with a kind of acceleration that changed everything around him. X-Men in 2000 made him a global phenomenon overnight. Then came film after film, Kate and Leopold, The Prestige, Australia, Les Miserables, The Greatest Showman, award seasons, magazine covers. The kind of fame that doesn't just change a career, it changes the atmosphere around a person. It changes the rooms they walk into. It changes what the world expects of them and of the people closest to them. Through all of it, Deborra-Lee stood beside him. She traveled with him. She advocated alongside him. She spoke about their marriage with a warmth and a groundedness that made people genuinely believe in what they had built. She once said that she always knew Hugh was her person. That she felt it early and she never questioned it. That kind of certainty is rare. It is the kind of thing people say in quiet moments, not for the press, not for the cameras. And it is exactly the reason why the separation, when it finally came in September 2023, landed with such unexpected weight, even for people who had never met them. Who had only ever known them through screens and headlines and carefully chosen public moments. A joint statement was released. It spoke of gratitude and of growth and of a separation after 27 years together. It was composed and dignified. The kind of language that two people reach for when they have agreed, at the very least, to protect what they once shared. But careful language always leaves gaps. And gaps, given enough time, have a way of filling themselves, with reflection, with memory, and eventually, with words that were never spoken when they should have been. There is a version of the Jackman-Furness marriage that lived in the public imagination almost like a myth, stable, devoted, built to last in a place where almost nothing lasts. And for a long time, the evidence genuinely seemed to support that version. They were rarely photographed in crisis. They didn't trade access to their private lives for flattering coverage. When they spoke about each other, in interviews, at events, in unguarded moments that managed to find their way to cameras, there was a softness there, a gentleness. That didn't feel rehearsed or manufactured. It felt like something real bleeding through. Deborra-Lee was never a woman who simply dissolved into her husband's orbit. She maintained her own identity, her own work, her own clearly defined voice. She appeared on panels and in conversations speaking with real frankness about the entertainment industry, about the way fame reshapes relationships when people aren't careful enough to protect them. She had been inside that world long enough to see it clearly. Hugh, for his part, credited her consistently and generously. He spoke openly and often about how much she had shaped him not just as a husband, but as a man, as a human being. There were interviews where his voice changed when he talked about her, where he said she was the anchor, where he said with real feeling that he didn't know who he would have become without her steadiness beside him. These weren't scripted answers. Or if they were, they had been rehearsed so thoroughly across 27 years that the difference no longer existed. What's worth noting is that the image they projected was never one of impossible perfection. They never pretended it was effortless. Deborra-Lee would occasionally speak carefully about the difficulty of holding a marriage together inside the demands of celebrity, the constant travel, the long distances, the relentless public gaze that followed them everywhere. She spoke about these things with honesty rather than complaint. That distinction matters more than it might seem. There is a real difference between a woman who performs contentment for the cameras and a woman who has genuinely reckoned with difficulty, absorbed it, processed it, and still consciously chosen to stay. For most of their marriage, she appeared to be the latter, but something at some point shifted quietly inside the equation. It didn't arrive with drama, it didn't announce itself. It came the way most profound and permanent changes do, gradually, almost invisibly, until one morning the weight of it was simply too much to carry any further. When the news broke in September 2023, the reaction was immediate and widespread. Not simply because celebrity separations happen, they happen constantly and people barely blink anymore. But because this particular separation felt like it was breaking a different kind of agreement, an unspoken one. The kind that exists between a public couple and the people who have quietly invested something of themselves in believing that the relationship was real. People had placed something emotional in this marriage, something almost personal. It had become a kind of reference point, a quiet proof that lasting love was still possible even in the most corrosive environment imaginable. The joint statement gave nothing away. It expressed gratitude, it asked for privacy. It was the most graceful exit that public life allows, and it left almost every meaningful question completely unanswered. What followed in the weeks and months after told a different story, not in words but in movement and in distance. Hugh was photographed in New York and London on set. He appeared composed and forward-facing. Reports described new social rhythms, a life already finding its next shape. He is a person built for momentum and he moved with it. Deborra-Lee moved in a different direction entirely. She returned to Australia. She stepped back from the visibility she had maintained throughout their marriage years. She gave a small number of interviews, measured, thoughtful, carefully worded, where she spoke about the separation in terms of self-discovery, of personal growth, of finally turning toward herself. But beneath all of that, something else was quietly happening. She was writing. According to reports, Deborra-Lee has been working on a deeply personal project, a book that people close to her describe not as a public grievance, not as a score being settled, but as something far more interior than that. A genuine reckoning with her own story, her own choices. Her own transformation as a woman who spent a significant portion of her life defined, at least in the public eye, primarily by her connection to someone else's extraordinary fame. That framing alone deserves a moment of real consideration. Here was a woman who had built genuine and meaningful things in her own right, serious advocacy work, professional accomplishments, a clear and fully developed personal philosophy. And yet, in headline after headline, in profile after profile, she appeared first and most often as Hugh Jackman's wife. A book changes that entirely. A book says quietly and completely, this is my story, my voice, my terms. No official manuscript has been released. No excerpts have been confirmed publicly. But according to people familiar with what she has been working on, and drawing from the interviews she has given since the separation, certain themes have started to emerge with a quiet, undeniable consistency. Identity is one of them. She has spoken in her own words and in her own time about the experience of losing herself, not in one sudden, dramatic moment, but slowly and incrementally, inside a marriage where one partner's career was expanding on a genuinely global scale. The constant movement, the relocation. The way a woman's own ambitions can compress, almost without her noticing, when the logistical and emotional demands of someone else's life take priority over and over again. She has been careful not to frame any of this as a direct accusation. She has been deliberate in placing the weight on larger systems, on Hollywood, on the nature of celebrity, on the cultural structures that quietly expect certain kinds of sacrifice from women in certain kinds of relationships. She has been precise about that, thoughtful about it, but careful framing does not erase what lives beneath it. And those paying close attention to her recent conversations have noticed that the portrait she paints of the later years of their marriage is one of a woman who had begun to feel herself disappearing. Not loudly, not in any way that would have been visible to outsiders, but deeply, privately in ways that mattered. The other theme that surfaces repeatedly, according to reports, is grief. Not only grief for the marriage itself, but grief for the version of herself she slowly set aside, the career paths not taken, the creative work not pursued. The woman she might have become if the weight of the equation had been distributed differently. There is something quietly devastating in that kind of reflection. It doesn't require a villain. It doesn't need a betrayal or a dramatic rupture to explain it. Sometimes the most lasting losses come through ordinary accumulation, through small decisions made again and again over years, that eventually add up to something you never consciously chose. Deborra-Lee appears to be writing directly toward that truth. And the questions it opens, about what their marriage genuinely looked like from the inside, about what Hugh understood and when he understood it, do not have easy or comfortable answers. Hugh Jackman has not responded directly to anything connected to the book. When he has spoken about the separation, he has done so in general terms with measured sadness, with visible care, with the kind of language that closes doors gently rather than opening them. But scrutiny, once it finds a direction, does not need a response in order to keep moving. In the months following the separation, reports began circulating about his personal life, about his social presence, about people he had been seen with, about the shape of his life now that the marriage had ended. None of these reports came with official confirmation. None of them resolved into clear or complete narratives, but they existed in the atmosphere. And they changed, subtly but meaningfully, the way people read the separation itself. What Deborra-Lee's book seems to be doing, and what her broader public positioning since the split appears to reflect, is something more nuanced than confrontation. It is the quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming a narrative that was never quite hers to begin with. For years, the story of their marriage was told primarily through Hugh's lens. He was the star. The profiles centered on him, the press opportunities centered on him, the cultural conversations centered on him. Deborra-Lee appeared in those stories faithfully, warmly, and most often in a supporting role, admirable and devoted. Occasionally granted her own moment near the end of an article before the focus returned to him. A book written entirely in her own voice reverses that structure completely. It insists that her inner experience has weight. That what she observed, what she felt, what she gave and absorbed across nearly 3 decades, all of it is worthy of a full accounting. Not a footnote, not a sidebar, a complete and honest account. People who have been around her recently describe a woman who seems, in some paradoxical way, more present than she has been in years. More grounded, more fully herself. The word that keeps appearing in those descriptions is liberation. Not liberation from Hugh, specifically, but liberation from a version of herself that had, over time, grown smaller than she actually was. That is not a small thing, and it raises questions that Hugh, wherever he is in his own quiet reckoning with all of this, is almost certainly sitting with. What does it feel like to watch someone you loved for 27 years begin, finally, to tell their own story? What does it feel like when that story, told with honesty rather than malice, casts its light into the corners where you fell short, not through cruelty, not through intention, but through the quiet, ordinary failures that every human being is eventually accountable for? There is a reason this story moves people who have never followed celebrity news a day in their lives. Because underneath the famous names and the Hollywood backdrop, the shape of what happened here is deeply familiar. One person's world expands, the other person's world quietly contracts. And for a long time, maybe a very long time, they find a way to make it work. Through love, through loyalty, through a shared belief that what they have together is worth whatever it costs. Until the person whose world contracted begins, slowly and then all at once, to feel the full weight of what they gave away. Starts to trace the outline of the life they never quite got to live. Starts to ask seriously and without easy answers, whether what they built together was as mutual as it always seemed. Deborra-Lee's book, based on everything that has been reported, is not a prosecution. It is not an attempt to rewrite history or assign blame in clean, satisfying ways. It is something harder and more honest than that. A woman in her 60s sitting down with her own life, looking at it without flinching and writing down what she actually finds there. And Hugh will have to sit with whatever that looks like, not as a celebrity managing his image, not as a public figure calculating a response. As a person who loved someone and was loved by them for 27 years, and who must now reckon with the truth that love, even real love, can sometimes ask more of one person than it does of another. That is uncomfortable in the most human way possible, and it is supposed to be, because honesty, when it finally arrives after a long silence, almost never feels gentle, it feels necessary. And necessary things rarely come quietly. What matters most in all of this is that Deborra-Lee is not approaching it with anger. That distinction is important. The tone that comes through in her interviews in what is understood about the book is not bitterness. It is clarity. And those two things, though they can look similar from a distance, are entirely different in what they want. Bitterness wants to wound. Clarity just wants to finally be seen. She spent a very long time being seen as one half of something larger than herself. Now, deliberately and on her own terms, she is choosing to be seen as a complete person, with her own history, her own truth, her own story worth telling in full. There is a particular kind of courage in writing your own story, especially when that story is woven through with someone the world has already made up its mind about. When the other person in your story is beloved by millions, telling the truth requires something quiet and firm and unshakable inside you. Deborra-Lee Furness does not appear to be doing this to win anyone over. She is not appearing on morning programs to build sympathy. She is not positioning herself as a victim waiting to be rescued by public opinion. What she seems to be doing is something quieter and more lasting than any of that. She is setting down a record of what she actually experienced, so that it exists somewhere outside of her own memory. Somewhere permanent, somewhere real. That matters in a way that is easy to underestimate. Memory is fragile. It softens edges over time. It rearranges events. It quietly rewrites meaning without ever asking for permission. A book does not do that. A book holds things in place. It says, this happened, I was here. This is how it felt to be me inside all of it. For Hugh, this must be a strange and deeply private kind of reckoning. To have been loved, genuinely and for so long, by someone who is now writing about what that love actually cost her. That is not something a statement manages. That is not something a publicist navigates. It lives somewhere far more personal than any of that. Somewhere only he has access to. What we are watching, in the growing distance between their two lives, is not simply the aftermath of a marriage ending. It is the slow unfolding of two separate and very human processes. Hugh moving forward, building new rhythms, finding whatever comes next. Deborra-Lee turning inward, sitting still long enough to write it all down honestly. Neither direction is wrong. Both are fully human responses to loss, but only one of them requires a willingness to stay inside the past long enough to understand what it truly meant. And perhaps that is the story underneath the story, not the headlines, not the tension or the speculation or the unanswered questions. The real story is what happens when a woman who spent decades quietly making room for someone else's life finally decides she deserves room of her own. What she writes will not answer everything. Some questions will remain open as they always do, some silences will hold. But the fact that she is writing at all, that after everything, she is choosing the weight of honest words over the ease of continued silence, is itself the answer to something important. Not to the public, not even to Hugh, but to herself, and perhaps that is the only place it ever really needed to start. If something in this story stayed with you, if it made you think about relationships, about sacrifice, about the things we quietly carry for longer than we ever should, take a moment and share what it brought up for you in the comments. These are the conversations that actually matter. If you want more stories told with this kind of honesty and care, subscribing means you won't miss them. And if someone in your life needed to hear something in all of this today, pass it along gently. Sometimes the right words find people at exactly the moment they need them most.